Yeah, our CBS News partners revealing some new GPS data from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, tracking the movements of the boat Nolan Wells was on before he disappeared July 4th.
The 4th of July is supposed to be remembered for fireworks, laughter, and time spent with the people you trust. For one Mississippi family, it became the day their lives split into two chapters, before and after. Before that morning, Nolan Wells was simply a young man looking forward to a holiday on the water. He was known by friends and family as energetic, outgoing, and someone who rarely passed up an opportunity to be around the people he cared about. Like thousands of others celebrating Independence Day along the Gulf Coast, he climbed aboard a boat expecting nothing more than a day of sunshine, music, and memories. No one imagined that it would become his final confirmed journey. Today, investigators continue piecing together what happened on Horn Island. Attorneys continue examining evidence. Nolan's parents continue searching for answers. And one question still hangs over every development. What really happened during those final hours? This documentary follows the confirmed timeline while separating verified facts from speculation. It is not about internet rumors or viral theories. It is about understanding how an ordinary holiday transformed into one of Mississippi's most closely watched investigations. Long before Nolan's name appeared across national headlines, Horn Island had earned a reputation as one of the Gulf Coast's most beautiful destinations. Located miles from the Mississippi mainland, the barrier island attracts boaters looking to escape crowded beaches. There are no neighborhoods, no convenience stores, and very little infrastructure. Visitors arrive by private boats, spend the day swimming or relaxing on the sand, then return before evening. Its isolation is part of its attraction. It is also what makes emergencies far more complicated. Once boats begin leaving for the mainland, anyone left behind faces an entirely different situation. Cell service can be inconsistent. Help is farther away. Distances that appear short across open water suddenly become much larger than they seem. For experienced boaters, planning when and how everyone leaves is one of the most important parts of the day. That simple reality would later become central to the investigation. According to publicly reported information, Nolan joined friends for the Independence Day outing. Nothing about the morning suggested anything unusual. The group boarded a boat and headed toward Horn Island, just like many others celebrating the holiday along Mississippi's coastline. The trip appeared routine. Friends enjoyed the beach, socialized, and spent hours together under the summer sun. At that point, nobody was documenting what would later become crucial details. Nobody was trying to remember exact conversations. Nobody believed investigators would eventually ask them to reconstruct the entire afternoon minute by minute. Only after Nolan disappeared did those ordinary moments become evidence. Investigators would later examine every timeline, every conversation, and every movement that occurred that day, hoping that something overlooked in real time might explain what happened later. When tragedies unfold unexpectedly, memory becomes a difficult thing. People remember different details. Some conversations become clearer over time. Others become harder to place. A sentence spoken casually on a beach suddenly carries enormous importance because it may have been one of the last things anyone heard. That is exactly what happened here. Investigators eventually determined that Nolan had spoken with another visitor before the group departed. For days, very little was publicly known about that interaction. Only one name surfaced repeatedly: Katie. For nearly 2 weeks, the public knew almost nothing beyond her first name, who she was, why she mattered, or what she and Nolan discussed. Meanwhile, online speculation filled the silence. Social media users attempted to identify people involved, often sharing incomplete or incorrect information. Rumors spread much faster than confirmed facts, creating confusion not only for the public, but also for families caught in the middle. As investigators continued their work privately, the internet moved in a completely different direction. The result was a flood of assumptions before basic facts had even been established. Imagine what those first hours felt like for Nolan's parents. A son who should have returned home never arrived. Phone calls replaced celebrations. Questions replaced certainty. Every passing minute without contact made the situation feel increasingly urgent. Like many families in similar circumstances, they searched for any piece of information that could explain where Nolan might be. Instead, they found uncertainty. According to accounts later shared publicly, Katie's name entered conversations during the initial search almost unexpectedly. Even more alarming, confusion briefly emerged, suggesting that she herself might also be missing. For a parent already searching desperately for one child, hearing that another possible witness could also be unaccounted for only intensified the fear. Fortunately, that information proved inaccurate. Katie had safely left Horn Island on another boat and returned home. She had never disappeared. But by then, precious time had already been consumed by uncertainty. It was another reminder of how quickly misinformation can complicate an already emotional investigation. As days passed, Katie's family eventually addressed the growing speculation. Sometimes an investigation isn't defined by what people know. It's defined by what they remember differently. In many cases, witnesses recall events from slightly different perspectives. A conversation might sound different depending on where someone was standing. A timeline may blur after a stressful experience. But occasionally, investigators encounter something much more significant. Two first-hand accounts that simply cannot both be true. As Nolan Wells' case unfolded, one particular contradiction began drawing increasing attention. Not because it proved what happened, but because it challenged investigators to determine which version most accurately reflected Nolan's final known intentions. It wasn't an internet theory. It wasn't anonymous speculation. It was a disagreement between people who were actually there that day. And for Nolan's family, resolving that contradiction became one of the most important unanswered questions in the entire investigation. Every investigation begins by answering one basic question. What happened last? For Nolan, investigators worked backward from the final confirmed interactions on Horn Island. Among those interactions was his conversation with Katie. For days, very little was publicly known about what they discussed. As attorneys and investigators gathered statements, that conversation gradually became one of the most closely examined moments of the day. Not because anyone suggested wrongdoing during the exchange, but because it may have revealed Nolan's plans just before he disappeared. Understanding a person's intentions in their final known moments can dramatically influence how investigators interpret everything that follows. Did he intend to leave? Did he intend to stay? Or did circumstances unexpectedly change after the conversation ended? Those questions became increasingly important as additional statements emerged. According to public statements made by attorneys representing Nolan's family, Katie consistently described the conversation in a very specific way. She reportedly told investigators that Nolan planned to return to his friends and leave the island with them. If accurate, that would suggest Nolan expected to be back on the boat before it departed. But another version of events also existed. Friends who had been with Nolan reportedly told investigators something different. According to their account, Nolan made the decision to remain on Horn Island rather than leave with the group. Those are not minor differences in wording. They describe two completely different decisions. One suggests Nolan intended to return home. The other suggests he voluntarily remained behind. Both versions cannot accurately describe the same moment. Somewhere between those two accounts lies an answer investigators continue working to understand. For Nolan's parents, this contradiction wasn't simply another detail in an investigation. It became deeply personal. Every parent naturally wants to understand the final choices their child made. Were they happy? Were they worried? Did they feel safe? Did they intend to come home? Most families eventually receive answers to those questions. For the Wells family, those answers remain uncertain. Imagine carrying two completely different versions of your son's final decision. One says he planned to leave. The other says he chose not to. Neither explanation has been publicly confirmed as the definitive account. That uncertainty creates a different kind of grief. Not simply mourning a loss, but struggling to understand the final chapter of someone you knew better than anyone else. Investigators understand that contradictions are not unusual. Human memory isn't perfect. People remember conversations differently. Stress affects perception. Even honest witnesses can recall the same event in different ways. That is why investigators rarely rely on one statement alone. Instead, they compare witness interviews with physical evidence, digital records, timelines, photographs, and other independently verified information. Every new piece of evidence is measured against existing accounts. If a timeline matches, confidence increases. If new evidence conflicts, questions multiply. That careful process takes time. And in a case receiving intense national attention, investigators face additional pressure to separate facts from assumptions without rushing conclusions. As public interest continued growing, Social media often treated the contradiction as though it already had an answer. It didn't. Online discussions frequently attempted to identify who was telling the truth long before investigators had publicly reached any conclusions. Some posts presented opinions as established facts. Others amplified rumors that later proved inaccurate. For Nolan's family, each rumor created another emotional burden. Every incorrect claim required clarification. Every false narrative distracted attention from verified evidence. Families involved in high-profile investigations often describe this as grieving under a microscope. Not only must they cope with unimaginable loss, they also watch strangers debate details of their loved one's final hours without having access to the complete investigation. That experience can be overwhelming. It is one reason investigators often urge patience while evidence is carefully reviewed. Meanwhile, attorneys representing Nolan's family continued emphasizing one point. They were seeking answers, not assumptions. Public statements repeatedly called for a complete examination of every available piece of evidence. That included witness interviews, electronic records, physical evidence, and the digital devices connected to the investigation. Their position remained consistent. Before anyone reaches conclusions, every question deserves a careful answer. For Nolan's parents, certainty matters more than speed. They have repeatedly stated that understanding what truly happened is more important than accepting an explanation that leaves critical questions unresolved. As investigators reconstructed the afternoon, attention gradually shifted beyond witness interviews. Technology offered another source of information. Unlike memory, digital systems do not forget conversations because of stress. GPS devices record movement. Phones preserve timestamps. Memories can fade. Witnesses can disagree. Conversations can be remembered differently months later than they were on the day they happened. But digital systems work differently. A GPS tracker doesn't know who is telling the truth. A timestamp has no opinion. Electronic records simply document where something was, when it moved, and how long it remained there. That is why investigators often rely on digital evidence to help reconstruct events after witness interviews have been completed. In Nolan Wells' case, one of the most significant developments came not from another eyewitness, but from GPS records documenting the movements of the boat involved that day. Those records didn't answer every question, but they established a timeline that investigators could independently examine, separate from memory or personal interpretation. According to publicly reported information, GPS data maintained by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources documented the boat's movements throughout July 4th. Unlike personal recollections, these records were automatically generated. They simply recorded location and movement. According to those records, the boat departed its dock during the morning and later arrived at Horn Island. For several hours afterward, nothing appeared unusual. Friends spent the holiday on the island. People relaxed along the shoreline. Boats came and went throughout the afternoon, much like any busy Independence Day celebration on Mississippi's Gulf Coast. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary summer holiday. But investigators now know that before sunset, the day would take a devastating turn. According to the GPS timeline, the boat eventually departed Horn Island later that afternoon. One detail immediately became central to the investigation. Nolan Wells was no longer on board. Exactly why he remained behind, and under what circumstances, continues to be one of the unanswered questions investigators are examining. The GPS data itself cannot explain why. It cannot tell investigators what conversations occurred before departure. It cannot reveal anyone's intentions. But it can establish that after leaving Horn Island, the boat continued its journey without Nolan. That single fact transformed an ordinary travel log into one of the most closely examined pieces of evidence in the case. What happened next surprised many people following the investigation. The boat didn't simply return to its original dock and remain there for the evening. According to the GPS records, it continued making additional movements after leaving Horn Island. Investigators later reviewed each of those recorded locations. The vessel reportedly traveled through additional waterways before returning again. Later that evening, GPS data indicated another movement toward a boat launch. Eventually, records showed the boat being removed from the water and transported over land. Each movement was automatically documented. Each timestamp became another point investigators could compare against witness statements and other evidence. None of those movements automatically imply wrongdoing. Boats are routinely transported and stored after recreational outings. But in a major investigation, investigators carefully reconstruct every movement to understand the complete timeline. Even routine actions become important when determining exactly what happened during a critical window of time. Digital evidence extends far beyond GPS tracking. Modern investigations increasingly rely on phones, applications, electronic communications, photographs, and location history. Each device has the potential to preserve moments people themselves may not remember. That brings investigators to another key piece of evidence in Nolan's case: his cell phone. To most people, a phone is simply part of daily life. Messages, photos, maps, calls, social media. For investigators, however, it can become an extraordinarily valuable source of information. Not because it always answers every question, but because it sometimes documents activity automatically. That information can help establish timelines, communication patterns, and movements during critical periods. According to statements made publicly by those close to the family, Nolan regularly used social media. Posting updates had become part of his normal routine. Friends reportedly described it as consistent behavior. Then something changed. According to those statements, activity associated with his account became unusually quiet during the period investigators were most interested in understanding. For those who knew Nolan, that silence stood out. On its own, a lack of social media activity proves very little. People often choose not to post. Phones lose battery. Signals disappear. Applications malfunction. Investigators understand there are many ordinary explanations. Nevertheless, when combined with other evidence, digital activity, or the absence of it, can become one more piece of a much larger puzzle. Investigators also faced another challenge. According to public reporting, questions emerged regarding the reported location associated with Nolan's phone compared with where the device was ultimately recovered. Understanding why electronic locations differ is rarely straightforward. Location services can be affected by signal availability. Applications record information differently. GPS accuracy varies depending on environmental conditions. For investigators, discrepancies like these are not automatically treated as evidence of wrongdoing. Instead, they become technical questions requiring careful forensic analysis. That is exactly why specialists are often brought into cases involving digital evidence. Their role is not to speculate. Their responsibility is to determine precisely what electronic records actually show. Only then can investigators compare those findings with witness interviews and physical evidence. While the public debated theories online, Nolan's parents focused on something much simpler. They wanted reliable answers. Every new report, every digital record, every confirmed timestamp, every investigation reaches a moment when the focus shifts. The search is over. The timelines have been assembled. Witnesses have been interviewed. Evidence has been collected. From that point forward, the question is no longer simply what happened. It becomes something much more difficult. Can the available evidence explain it? For Nolan Wells' family, that moment arrived not with relief, but with another period of waiting. Waiting for investigators. Waiting for forensic analysis. Waiting for prosecutors. Waiting for answers that still had not fully arrived. By then, the case had grown far beyond Mississippi's Gulf Coast. Millions of people had followed the story. Countless theories had circulated online. Some claimed to know exactly what happened. Others insisted the mystery had already been solved. But investigators remained focused on something entirely different: evidence. Because in any investigation, evidence, not public opinion, determines what comes next. As investigators continued reviewing the case, Nolan's parents met directly with representatives from the district attorney's office. For families navigating a major investigation, those meetings often carry enormous emotional weight. They're an opportunity to ask questions, to understand where the investigation stands, and perhaps most importantly, to hear directly from the people responsible for evaluating the evidence. According to public reporting, attorneys representing Nolan's family described the meeting as respectful and productive. While it did not provide every answer the family hoped for, it marked an important step in communication between investigators and Nolan's loved ones. One significant update also emerged. Once investigators completed their work, the case would be presented to a grand jury. The words grand jury often generate immediate headlines. To many people, They sound like proof that criminal charges are imminent. But that is not how the legal system works. A grand jury serves a very specific purpose. Its responsibility is to review evidence presented by prosecutors and determine whether there is sufficient legal basis to proceed with criminal charges. It does not decide guilt. It does not conduct a trial. It does not determine innocence. Instead, it evaluates whether the available evidence meets the legal standard necessary for the next stage of the judicial process. That distinction is important, especially in cases receiving widespread public attention. A grand jury referral should never be interpreted as proof that investigators have reached final conclusions. It represents another step in the legal process, not the end of it. Another subject receiving considerable public attention involved the role of federal authorities. As interest in the investigation expanded, many online discussions claimed the FBI had taken control of the case. That claim spread rapidly across social media. According to official statements referenced in public reporting, however, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office remained the lead investigative agency. Federal authorities assisted with specific matters related to threats connected to the investigation, particularly where those threats crossed state lines. That assistance did not replace the local investigation. Instead, it reflected cooperation between agencies performing different responsibilities. Clarifying that distinction became important because misinformation often spreads much faster than official corrections. Throughout this investigation, separating verified facts from online speculation remained one of the greatest challenges facing both investigators and the public. Another significant development centered on Nolan's cell phone. Earlier in the investigation, attorneys representing the family repeatedly emphasized the importance of thoroughly examining the device. Eventually, both sides agreed to pursue a joint forensic inspection involving technical experts. Rather than conducting entirely separate analyses, specialists would examine the evidence together and compare findings through a collaborative process. For Nolan's family, that agreement represented more than a procedural decision. It represented hope. Hope that technology might reveal details unavailable through witness interviews alone. As of the reporting summarized in the source material, that examination had not yet been completed. Like so many other aspects of the investigation, the family continued waiting. Waiting had become an unavoidable part of everyday life. Waiting for searches, waiting for reports, waiting for meetings, waiting for forensic examinations, waiting for answers that still remained just beyond reach. As investigators continued their work, another challenge emerged. Misinformation. Few modern investigations escape the influence of social media. Images circulate without context. Old videos are presented as new evidence. Rumors quickly become accepted as fact before anyone verifies them. Nolan's case was no exception. One widely shared photograph led many online to believe it showed Nolan after July 4th. Public reporting later clarified that the image had actually been taken earlier, before the events surrounding his disappearance, and only uploaded later, creating understandable confusion about its timing. Another video generated similar speculation. Some viewers believed it captured Nolan during a confrontation shortly before his disappearance. According to public statements referenced in reporting, that interpretation was incorrect. The voice heard in the recording belonged to someone else. These corrections may seem small,